The clock started ticking at midnight. 48 hours. Not a suggestion, not a recommendation. An ultimatum delivered through channels that don't officially exist, wrapped in the language of concern, but carrying the unmistakable weight of consequence. Ibrahim Traoré, the 35-year-old military leader who seized power in Burkina Faso through a September 2022 coup, now faces a deadline engineered not to solve a crisis, but to manufacture submission. This is not about dialogue. This is about breaking a man who has become the most visible symbol of resistance to Western influence in the Sahel. And the 48 hours are designed to do what military pressure and economic isolation have so far failed to accomplish: force Burkina Faso back into a system it publicly rejected. The ultimatum itself is precise in its vagueness. Cooperate, align, return to stability. The terms are never fully spelled out because clarity would expose the true demand. Abandon the sovereignty project, reverse the expulsion of French troops, walk back the pivot toward Russia, and return to the old arrangement where Ouagadougou took orders dressed as partnership. The deadline is psychological warfare, a countdown that turns every hour into mounting pressure, every minute into a reminder that defiance carries costs. It is delivered not through official diplomatic notes, but through intermediaries, intelligence networks, and the kind of back channels that allow plausible deniability. If Traoré complies, the narrative will be cooperation. If he resists, the narrative will be instability, and the consequences will be presented as self-inflicted. But here is what makes this moment different from the dozens of ultimatums issued to African leaders over the past 6 decades. Traoré knows the playbook. He has watched how pressure campaigns work, studied the patterns of regime change, and understands that the 48-hour deadline is not a countdown to action. It is a tool to create panic, to isolate him from allies, to force mistakes born from fear. The goal is not to invade Burkina Faso or launch airstrikes. The goal is to make Traoré believe he has no choice, to convince him that resistance is futile, and to extract compliance through the appearance of inevitability. The ultimatum is designed to make him blink first. And so, as the hours begin to pass, a coordinated pressure campaign unfolds across multiple fronts. It is not chaotic. It is synchronized with the precision of a military operation, each element calibrated to reinforce the message that Traoré is running out of time and options. The media front moves first. International outlets, citing unnamed sources and regional analysts, begin publishing stories that question Burkina Faso's stability. The framing is careful, not overtly hostile, but subtly corrosive. Reports surface about internal divisions within Traoré's government, speculation about military dissatisfaction, warnings about economic collapse. The stories do not need to be proven. They need to circulate, to create the impression that Traoré's position is weaker than it appears, that his support is fragile, that his defiance is leading the country toward disaster. The narratives are amplified through social media, where accounts with significant reach begin echoing the same themes. Stability, responsibility, the cost of isolation. The language is not crude propaganda. It is sophisticated influence, the kind that plants doubt rather than making explicit accusations. The goal is to shift perception, to make Traoré's resistance seem reckless rather than principled, to turn sovereignty into a luxury Burkina Faso cannot afford. The stories spread quickly, picked up by regional media networks, debated in think tank panels, referenced in policy briefings. Within hours, the narrative is established. Traoré is driving his country into crisis, and the solution is obvious: cooperate before it is too late. While the media front builds psychological pressure, the financial front tightens quietly. This is where power operates without spectacle, where leverage is applied through systems most people never see. Banking relationships become suddenly complicated. Transactions face unexplained delays. Credit lines are reviewed. International financial institutions, which operate with technical independence but respond to political signals, begin expressing concern about Burkina Faso's fiscal trajectory. The language is always cautious, always framed as prudent oversight, but the effect is tangible. Access to capital becomes conditional. Investment flows slow. The message is clear without ever being stated directly. There is a price for defiance, and it is being calculated in real time. Currency pressures begin to mount. Burkina Faso, like most Francophone West African nations, operates within the CFA franc zone, a monetary system that ties 14 African countries to the euro through the French treasury. For years, critics have described the CFA franc as a tool of neo-colonial control, a mechanism that limits monetary sovereignty and ensures French influence over economies that are nominally independent. Traore has openly questioned this arrangement, aligning himself with leaders in Mali and Niger who see the CFA franc as incompatible with true sovereignty. Now, as the 48-hour deadline counts down, the financial architecture tied to that system becomes a weapon. Liquidity tightens. Foreign exchange access becomes restricted. The technical justifications are impeccable, but the timing is unmistakable. Simultaneously, surveillance closes in. This is the invisible layer of modern geopolitics, where satellites track movements, communications are monitored, and intelligence networks map every connection. Traore's government, already operating under the assumption that its communications are compromised, becomes acutely aware that the monitoring has intensified. Signals intelligence picks up increased chatter among regional military forces. Satellite passes over key infrastructure become more frequent. The surveillance is not hidden, it is meant to be noticed, to remind Traore that his actions are being watched in real time, that there are no private decisions, no room for maneuvering outside the gaze of actors who have the capacity to respond instantly. The diplomatic front activates with coordinated messaging. Statements begin emerging from regional bodies, international organizations, and allied governments. The language is remarkably consistent. Calls for dialogue, concerns about stability, encouragement to pursue cooperative solutions. The statements are always framed as neutral, as concerned mediation rather than pressure, but the pattern reveals coordination. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which has already suspended Burkina Faso following the coup, issues warnings about the consequences of continued isolation. The African Union echoes concerns about regional security. European governments express hope that Burkina Faso will choose partnership over confrontation. The United States, through State Department briefings, emphasizes the importance of stability and democratic norms. None of these statements explicitly reference the 48-hour deadline because officially, no such deadline exists. But the timing is synchronized, the messaging is aligned, and the cumulative effect is to create a diplomatic consensus that Traore is the problem and cooperation is the solution. The diplomatic pressure is designed to make resistance appear not just difficult but illegitimate, to isolate Burkina Faso not through overt hostility but through the polite architecture of international concern. Traore watches this unfold and recognizes it for what it is, a trap. The 48-hour deadline is not a negotiation. It is a submission mechanism dressed as crisis management. If he complies, the narrative will be that pressure works, that ultimatums bring wayward leaders back into line, and that sovereignty can be traded for stability. If he refuses, the consequences will be portrayed as his fault, his recklessness, his failure to prioritize his people over ideology. Either way, the ultimatum is designed to produce a predetermined outcome: Traore's capitulation or his isolation. But here is where the calculation miscalculates. Traore does not respond with panic. He does not scramble for last-minute negotiations or issue desperate reassurances. Instead, he does something more dangerous. He creates uncertainty. Rather than accepting the terms of the deadline, he refuses to engage on their timeline. He does not comply, but he also does not openly defy in ways that provide clear justification for escalation. He signals through actions and silence that Burkina Faso will not be bullied into submission by manufactured urgency. This is strategic ambiguity, the deliberate refusal to give adversaries the clarity they need to execute their next move. By not complying on their terms and not providing a clear provocation, Traore forces those behind the ultimatum to choose their next step without the clean narrative they were engineering. He turns the 48-hour deadline from a weapon into a miscalculation, exposing the bluff embedded in the threat. The countdown was meant to create inevitability, Instead, it reveals the limits of coercion when the target refuses to accept the script. And then Russia responds, not with public statements or official declarations, but through the channels and signals that matter in modern geopolitics. Russian military advisors, already present in Burkina Faso following the withdrawal of French forces, make their presence more visible. Security cooperation is quietly intensified. Intelligence sharing expands. The message is delivered not through press conferences, but through actions that shift the strategic balance. Russia signals that Traore is not isolated, that pressure on Burkina Faso will be met with support, and that the ultimatum is not being issued in a vacuum where the West alone determines consequences. This is where the 48-hour deadline begins to collapse as a tool of intimidation. The entire mechanism depends on isolation, on making Traore believe he has no alternatives, no allies willing to pay the cost of backing him. Russia's response breaks that isolation, turning the countdown from a unilateral pressure campaign into a contested geopolitical moment. The ultimatum was designed to force Traore into a binary choice between submission and catastrophe. Russia's involvement creates a third option: resistance with support, defiance backed by an alternative security architecture. The shift is significant because it changes the cost calculation for everyone involved. Escalating against Burkina Faso is no longer a simple matter of squeezing an isolated state. It becomes a confrontation with Russian interests in the Sahel, a region where Moscow has systematically expanded influence, as Western powers have retreated or been expelled. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger form a contiguous bloc where Russian private military contractors operate, where security partnerships have replaced French military presence, and where governments have explicitly rejected Western political frameworks. Pressuring Traore now means accepting the risk that Russia will deepen its commitments, that the Sahel's realignment away from Western influence will accelerate rather than reverse. This is not the Cold War. This is not a global ideological contest. This is transactional geopolitics, where alignment is based on immediate interests rather than long-term alliances. Russia offers Burkina Faso what the West increasingly does not: security cooperation without political conditions, economic partnerships without structural adjustment demands, and diplomatic support without lectures about governance. The relationship is not built on shared values but on mutual benefit. Burkina Faso gains security and sovereignty support. Russia gains strategic presence and resource access. The 48-hour ultimatum was designed to break this logic by making the costs unbearable. Instead, it has reinforced it by demonstrating exactly why Traore sought alternatives in the first place. As the deadline approaches, the dynamics shift from intimidation to exposure. Traore begins signaling, through state media and allied networks, that the pressure campaign is not invisible, that the ultimatum is not secret, and that Burkina Faso will not negotiate sovereignty under duress. The messaging is calibrated to turn the deadline into a liability for those who imposed it. By making the pressure visible, Traore forces accountability. The actors behind the ultimatum wanted compliance without fingerprints, coercion without responsibility. Exposure removes that cover, making the pressure campaign a political issue rather than a technical process. This is where escalation cuts both ways. The ultimatum was meant to force Traore into a corner. Instead, it has created a situation where backing down reveals weakness, where following through requires escalation that exposes contradictions, and where the 48-hour deadline becomes a marker of strategic overreach. If nothing happens after the deadline passes, the bluff is called and the credibility of future ultimatums diminishes. If consequences follow, they must be justified publicly, defended diplomatically, and sustained politically, all while Traore frames them as attacks on sovereignty rather than responses to instability. The crisis does not end when the 48 hours expire. There is no dramatic showdown, no sudden capitulation, no military intervention. Instead, the deadline passes into the murky space where geopolitical pressure either escalates into something more dangerous or dissipates into the background noise of ongoing tensions. What becomes clear is that the ultimatum failed in its primary objective. Traore was not broken, Burkina Faso was not isolated. The narrative of inevitability did not materialize. But the broader struggle continues because this was never just about one deadline or one leader. This is about whether sovereignty in the Sahel will be defined by states themselves or by external actors who demand alignment as the price of legitimacy. The 48-hour ultimatum was an attempt to reassert the old logic that African states who defy Western interests will face consequences calibrated to force compliance. Traore's resistance, backed by Russia's strategic support, signals a different logic, that sovereignty is not a gift granted by external powers, but a right defended through leverage, alliances, and the willingness to accept costs. The message that emerges from this confrontation is uncomfortable for those accustomed to uncontested influence. Sovereignty does not erode in one dramatic moment of invasion or conquest. It erodes through forced agreements, through ultimatums presented as diplomacy, through financial pressure dressed as prudent oversight, through narratives that make resistance seem irrational. Each concession, each capitulation to manufactured urgency, each acceptance of conditions imposed by others. These are the mechanisms through which independence is traded for stability, and autonomy is exchanged for access. Traore's choice to resist the 48-hour ultimatum is not a guarantee of success. Burkina Faso remains fragile, economically vulnerable, and facing a jihadist insurgency that has displaced millions and killed thousands. The partnership with Russia brings its own dependencies and costs. The pressure campaign has not ended. It has simply adapted, searching for new leverage points, new vulnerabilities, new ways to make defiance unsustainable. The struggle is far from over, but the refusal to submit on terms dictated by others matters because it establishes a precedent. It demonstrates that ultimatums can be resisted, that isolation can be countered with alternative partnerships, and that sovereignty is not inevitable surrender dressed as pragmatism. Other leaders in the region are watching. Other governments facing similar pressure are calculating whether resistance is possible. The outcome in Burkina Faso will shape those calculations. What happens next could redefine not just Burkina Faso's trajectory, but the broader geopolitical order in the Sahel and beyond. If Traore consolidates his position, delivers security gains, and demonstrates that alternative partnerships can provide stability without submission, the model spreads. If his government collapses under sustained pressure, if the economy fractures, if jihadist violence escalates beyond control, the narrative will shift. Sovereignty rhetoric could not deliver material results, and defiance proved unsustainable. The 48-hour ultimatum was designed to foreclose this uncertainty, to force a resolution before Traore had time to build sustainable alternatives. Its failure to achieve that goal means the contest continues, fought not on battlefields, but through economic systems, diplomatic networks, media narratives, and security partnerships. The actors involved understand that this is not just about Burkina Faso. This is about whether the architecture of influence that has governed African geopolitics for decades can reassert itself in a region that has explicitly rejected it. Traore stands at the center of that contest, a young military leader with no democratic mandate but significant popular support, a figure who has channeled decades of frustration with corruption, foreign intervention, and security failures into a sovereignty project that resonates across borders. He is not a hero in the simplistic sense. His government operates under military authority, civil liberties are constrained, and the path ahead is fraught with risks. But he represents something that cannot be dismissed as mere opportunism or demagoguery. The demand that African states should control their own security, resources, and political futures. The 48-hour ultimatum sought to turn that demand into submission through calibrated pressure and manufactured urgency. It failed not because pressure was insufficient, but because Traore understood the trap and chose resistance over compliance, even knowing the costs. Russia's support provided the strategic space to make that choice viable. The exposure of the pressure campaign turned a covert operation into a visible political contest. And the passage of the deadline without capitulation demonstrated that ultimatums only work when the target accepts the terms of the game. This moment will be remembered not for what happened in 48 hours, but for what did not. The expected collapse, the predicted submission, the reassertion of influence through fear. Instead, the deadline passed. Traore remained in power. Burkina Faso remained defiant. And the question of sovereignty in the Sahel remained unresolved. The crisis did not end. It evolved into a longer, more complex struggle where the outcomes are uncertain and the stakes are profound. Is this sustainable? Can Burkina Faso maintain this trajectory without external support becoming dependency? Can Traore deliver the security and stability that justify the costs of defiance? Or will the pressure eventually find the breaking point, the moment when resistance becomes impossible and the system reasserts itself through mechanisms too powerful to counter? These questions do not have clear answers because the contest is still unfolding and the variables are constantly shifting. What is clear is that sovereignty in this context is not a declaration. It is a continuous act of resistance against forces that seek to make it conditional. The 48-hour ultimatum was one move in that struggle. Traore's refusal to comply was another. Russia's support was another. The exposure of the pressure campaign was another. Each move reshapes the terrain, changes the calculations, and determines whether independence remains possible or becomes another casualty of geopolitical power. The countdown has ended, but the real test is just beginning. Burkina Faso's future will be determined not by deadlines, but by whether Traore can transform defiance into stability, rhetoric into results, and resistance into a sustainable model of governance. The world is watching, and the implications reach far beyond the Sahel. This is where sovereignty is either defended or surrendered, where ultimatums either work or fail, and where the architecture of influence either adapts or breaks. The message is no longer hidden behind diplomatic language or manufactured crises. It is clear, direct, and unavoidable. Sovereignty is not lost in one moment. It erodes through forced agreements, and some leaders will choose resistance over silent submission, regardless of the cost.